Continuing on page 52 of chapter 3, Rorty reiterates his point that he is not in the business of giving a foundation for liberal culture, where a foundation would be a justification that is convincing not only to people who are already committed to liberalism, but also to people from maybe very different cultures with very different ideas. A foundation of liberal culture would be something that could convince even them that liberalism, that a liberal culture is the right way to go. Now, Rorty doesn't think that that is possible. So instead, what is his business is giving an improved self-description of our culture. Now, how should we improve the self-description of our culture? Rorty is going to explain this in terms of the Enlightenment. Because although Rorty thinks that our liberal culture is in an important sense an effect of the Enlightenment, and in an important sense we should embrace and even extend the Enlightenment, there is also something about the Enlightenment, like this cultural movement that, you know, we roughly locate in the 18th century. There's also something about the Enlightenment that is no longer useful. And that which is no longer useful is the Enlightenment's emphasis on rationality, on rationalism, and its idea that the prototypical human being, the person who does most for freedom and who does most for our culture, is the scientist. And so here on page 52, Rorty tells us that, you know, science is no longer at the forefront of human culture, partly because of its incredible specialization. It has made our culture possible, but it is no longer, Rorty says, at the forefront of culture. What is at the forefront of culture, and I'm at the bottom of page 52, the areas which are at the forefront of culture, those which excite the imagination of the young, are art and utopian politics. Art and utopian politics. So that's where we want to focus our attention. If we want to push our culture forward, if we want to describe our culture in the best possible terms that capture most of the energy and the goodness that is in our culture, the prototypical human being should no longer be the scientist who is like this purely rational being trying to get at objective truth. That was useful when we were trying to criticize religion, when we were trying to free ourselves from traditional authorities. Now what we need is more emphasis on this creative, artistic, aesthetic aspect of our culture, in order to free ourselves from the very notion that there is some objective world out there to which we are responsible. Right? As we saw in the last video, the only thing to which Rorty thinks we are responsible are other human beings. And so emphasizing the artistic in culture is giving up the project of finding a foundation and embracing the idea that what we need are ever more better new self-descriptions. So that is what Rorty is doing. I'm not 100% sure whether he's right, that what excites the imagination of the young is art and utopian politics, but there is a sense in which I hope that he is right, because it would be great if the young are excited by art and by utopian politics, by hope, by these visions of a better future. I think one of the complaints that we hear a lot in like the last decade or so is that it has become harder and harder for the young to have a utopian vision. Definitely one of the things that Rorty wants to do is he wants to sort of give us a self-description that allows us to keep our utopian hopes, our ideas of progress, of getting to a better place. He wants to keep that alive, right? He wants to, he has no truck with the kind of despair that comes from the idea that society cannot be changed, right? Or that human nature is such that we will always be in a state like the current state, right? Rorty has no truck with that. Rorty firmly believes that we ought to hold a self-image that involves this infinite creativity and therefore the infinite possibility of change, including change towards the better. So that is the basic thing that we want to be doing. This will help us overcome the idea that we need a foundation. Rorty tells us on page 54 that, questions like, how do you know that freedom is the chief goal of social organization? We should regard them in the same way that we regard questions like, how do you know that Jones is worthy of your friendship? It might not be the case that there's nothing to be answered to that, but it's certainly not the case that in order to strike up a friendship, we first need a foundation or a proof that somebody is worthy of being my friend. Or that in order to embrace a certain ideal or a certain hero, I first need a philosophical story that proves objectively that this is an ideal or this person is a hero. So I don't think that Rorty is recommending that we don't talk about this at all. I mean, it can be useful to think through your friendships or your heroes, but he is recommending that we are not waiting for somebody to give a philosophical foundation to our utopian hopes any more than we do to our than we ask somebody to give a philosophical foundation to our private loves and friendships. Now, on page 55, Rorty adds an element to the story, which I think is very important. He says, this is at the middle of page 55, once we figure out how to use the vocabularies of these movements, we can tell a story of progress, showing how the literalization of certain metaphors served the purpose of making possible all the good things that have recently happened. So what Rorty is telling us here is that from our current perspective, it is possible to see historical changes in the past as a progressive story, as leading up to the good stuff that is happening right now. And I think this is important for the kind of vision that Rorty wants to sell us. Right? Rorty doesn't want to give a vision where there's just a lot of arbitrary change. Right? That's one way of thinking about contingency. There's just a lot of arbitrary change. Pantarei, nothing is solid or eternal. That's life. Learn to live with it. No, Rorty has this utopian impulse, right? And part of this utopian impulse is to emphasize the kinds of stories that show our past, that which leads to us, as a story of progress which is not yet finished, right? Which is still pointing towards more progress in the future. That is the kind of story that Rorty wants to tell. Whether he can tell it, right, that is of course one of the fundamental philosophical questions here. Is it possible to embrace contingency and irony in the way that Rorty does and think of yourself as being part of this story of progress? Well, Rorty says yes, but it's one of the questions that we are continually, I would say, asking about the book. So one of the things that's interesting here is also that Rorty emphasizes this idea that, Christianity, Newton, the Romantic poets and so on, they didn't know that they were leading up to us, right? They couldn't have told the story that we can tell, but we, looking back, can tell that story. So we can see all these movements as progress towards an us that could not have been foreseen, right? So progress towards an us that could not have been foreseen. I think one of the reasons this is important is that it sheds some light on the way that Rorty sometimes talks about truth. Right? When Rorty says that there is nothing about truth that lies beyond people coming to agreement, right? He doesn't mean the people here and now, like, a couple of, or even all the people come together and say, oh yeah, we agree about this. That is what truth is, right? What is true is agreement among some better version of ourselves. But that better version of ourselves can't be foreseen. It is only in retrospect that people can recognize themselves as better versions of us, as we are now, in the same way that we can recognize ourselves as better versions of, the people in the past. At least that is, if we are able to tell this story of progress, then that is what is happening. And so Rorty is in no way, I would say, claiming that the truth is sort of transparent or always accessible to any social community, because there is always this element of the unforeseeable in this notion of progress towards a better version of ourselves. So what Rorty brings in next is Horkheimer and Adorno. So Horkheimer and Adorno wrote a very famous book, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, It was written basically around the Second World War, very much inspired by Nazism. Horkheimer and Adorno both fled Europe to the United States, wrote the Dialectic of Enlightenment, and the basic point of the Dialectic of Enlightenment is they say, look, the Enlightenment, which sort of, takes away all these authorities, it criticizes everything, it is suspicious about everything. Well, what it ends up doing is even criticizing, creating suspicion about itself, about its own belief in rationality, about its own belief in objective truth, its own belief in founding a moral society on objectively true human values, right? And so what happens is that the Enlightenment consumes itself, destroys itself, undermines itself, and this leads to a sort of age of nihilism. What's interesting about Rorty here is that he says, well, I kind of agree with that. I kind of agree that what the Enlightenment does with its emphasis on rationality and rational criticism is that it undermines even the notion that there is such a thing as objective rationality, which brings us towards, the one place that human beings ought to be. But of course, what results is not something that Rorty is going to call nihilism. He tries to tell a positive story about that. Right? He calls it contingency. He calls it irony. He says it leaves room for solidarity. He says that it creates room for the strong poet. And so he kind of agrees with Horkheimer and Adorno's story up to a point, but where they are very pessimistic, he sort of says, well, actually, this is good. So he tries to sort of take the Dialectic of Enlightenment and turn it into an optimistic story, a story of the creation of a realm in which a liberal society is possible. So Rorty identifies with the kind of people who will happily say that there are no non-circular justifications of our society, and some of the people that he mentions here and quotes are Dewey and Rawls and Oakeshott. And then we get to page 59, which is one of the most interesting pages, probably the single most interesting page in this chapter at least, and I think in some ways disastrous. So when I made the last video, I talked a little bit about how I think that Rorty gets into certain tensions with himself, and I said, well, I'm going to tell more about that in the next video, and this is where we're at. Let me just read it out, what happens here at the middle of page 59. And this is something Rorty is talking about, how his ideal liberal society functions. The importance of this shift is that it makes it impossible to ask the question, is ours a moral society? It makes it impossible to ask the question, is ours a moral society? I mean, we see where Rorty is coming from, right? He wants to say, look, there's no neutral perspective from which you can look at a society and say, oh, is it moral or not? Right? You're always inside a society and morality is defined by that society. But by pushing it to the point that he's pushing it here, by saying that it's impossible, that it is in fact good if it is impossible to ask the question, is ours a moral society? This is a disaster. Of course we need to be able to ask, is ours a moral society? Right? Of course we need to be able to generate moral criticisms of our own society. Of course it needs to be possible to, criticize from within every aspect of our morality, even if maybe not every aspect at once. This has some interesting implications, I would say, also for Rorty's reading of Orwell, which we will get to near the end of the book. Here's something else that happens on page 59. Suppose, Rorty says, that somebody does immoral actions again and again. If done by one of us, or if done repeatedly by one of us, that person ceases to be one of us. She becomes an outcast, someone who doesn't speak our language. So what Rorty is saying here is that a criminal, or somebody who behaves in immoral behavior, when they do it, like systematically enough, the way that we ought to think of them in his ideal liberal society is as no longer one of us, which means somebody who doesn't speak our language. this is amazing, but amazing in, again, if we take this literally as what it says here, it's amazing in a disastrous way, right? If somebody goes around, like, I don't know, murdering people, to say that oh, that person doesn't talk our language, right? He doesn't know what murder means. What? He doesn't know he doesn't know what good and bad mean. Of course he knows what murder is. I mean, maybe not, right? Maybe it's a totally crazy person, but let's assume that this is not a totally crazy person. This person knows completely well what they're doing. Surely the problem is not that they fail to speak our language. The problem is that they are engaging in immoral action. So it seems to me that Rorty is like, he is taking his idea of languages and the idea that morality only exists within a language so seriously that he destroys the possibility for moral deliberation, that he destroys even the possibility of evil in any sense, and that he, and that's I guess the worst thing, destroys the possibility of moral criticism. Now, Rorty doesn't want to seem to do that, right? Because the very next page, Rorty is going to emphasize that there can be moral criticism, right? And that there can be visions, like moral visions, that are not currently the way that our society thinks. So one of the things he does on the very next page is he talks about utopian speculation. Moral philosophy takes the form of historical narration and utopian speculation. What makes speculation utopian? Right? I mean, to speculate about the morality of society 100 years from now, that's one thing. That's making predictions maybe, or just vaguely thinking about, well, maybe people could live like this or like that. But what makes speculation utopian is the idea that that would be a better morality, right? That there's an improvement there, that there's a progress there. And of course, that means that we are morally criticizing our own society. Okay, here's something else that Rorty says, the way that he tries to explain this. The poet and the revolutionary are protesting in the name of the society itself against those aspects of the society which are unfaithful to its own self-image. This is a very nice idea, and Rorty has to say something like this, right? He has to say something like, okay, we can morally criticize our own society, but only from within that society, right? I mean, we need to take something that is in our society, something that we share with other people, in order to be able to talk about what is wrong with our society. And of course, I would say that is how, I even agree with Rorty, that is how moral discussions take place. But again, Rorty takes so seriously his idea of this monolithic language that we are caught in. The kind of language that would make it possible to say that you can't ask the question, is our society moral? The kind of language that makes it possible to say, this person doesn't speak our language. The kind of language which makes it possible to speak about the self-image of society. But of course society doesn't have a self-image, no more than it has a language. It has a billion self-images, or maybe we should say it has an incredibly rich amount of different overlapping but also contradictory self-images. And some people, might emphasize, some of them reject others of them. There is no uniformity. And it is from within this plurality that criticism is possible, right? It is by playing the tensions in society. It is by taking some of our ideals and playing them off against other of our ideals or realities that we can have a moral discourse, that we can criticize our society, and that something like a utopian vision is possible. And it seems to me that again and again Rorty gets into trouble by his very insistence on monolithic metaphors having to do with language and having to do with our being caught in a particular language, rather than emphasizing this plurality and these internal tensions that there are. Now, sometimes Rorty asserts this plurality, but very often he doesn't. And when he doesn't, that's when he gets into trouble. That's when he starts saying things like, you can't ask the question, is ours a moral society? That's when he starts saying things like, this person ceases to be one of us, someone who doesn't speak our language. That's when he says, poets and revolutionaries are protesting in the name of society itself against those aspects of the society which are unfaithful to its own self-image. I mean, clearly not everybody, I mean, it can't be the image that everyone has, right? If everyone has the same image, if everyone is conscious of the same image, then that will be what we are doing, right? So Rorty's very language here commits him to the idea that there is a self-image of society, but not everyone shares it, not everyone sees it. Some people do, and those are the people who will listen to the poet and the revolutionary. Well, what kind of people are they? They're the pure, right? Those who are not corrupted. This is precisely the distinction that Rorty early on in the chapter wanted to get rid of, right? Between those who get it, those who see it, the self-image of society in this case, and those who don't see it, and so who are doing the things that don't fit the self-image. Like Rorty's own rhetoric, some of Rorty's own ideas are leading him right back to the very things that he wants to dismiss. And so I think that if we want to do something with Rorty, what we need to do again and again and again is emphasize the pluralistic, emphasize the fact that there are no hard distinctions between languages, between people, that there is no such thing as somebody who doesn't speak our language. That, I think, is absolutely necessary in order to get Rorty, like the good thing in Rorty, off the ground. All right. So that is, I think, the most important point I wanted to make about this chapter. There's also, yeah, so again, on page 60, Rorty says this: a liberal society is one whose ideals can be fulfilled by persuasion rather than force. Well, persuasion is only possible when we are within the same language, right? That is what Rorty has told us. So again, like a society in which we always use persuasion and never use force would be a society in which everyone speaks the same language in a very strong sense of the word. Right? So again, I mean, Rorty is, I don't know whether he should say this. Right? I mean, maybe force is necessary sometimes. What if there are a couple of Nazis out there in society? I don't know. Okay, maybe in an ideal liberal society there are no Nazis, but then an ideal liberal society starts to sound a lot like a society of the pure, or a pure, you know, precisely the kind of thing that we don't want, and precisely the kind of thing in which there could be no strong poets, because the strong poets are those who generate languages that people don't speak, right? At least not yet. So, the final part of the chapter is about Foucault and Habermas, where Rorty defines these as, he says that Foucault is an ironist who is unwilling to be a liberal, whereas Habermas is a liberal who is unwilling to be an ironist. And you know, that could be sort of clarifying about his own position and his own, like Rorty's own place in the philosophical landscape, as well as about Foucault and Habermas. I'm not going to say a lot about that. So Rorty emphasizes that what Foucault does is he shows how patterns of acculturation characteristic of liberal societies have imposed on their members kinds of constraints of which older pre-modern societies had not dreamed. So what Foucault does is he shows that our very liberal institutions have bad side effects. They sort of constrain us. They give us freedom maybe, but they also take away certain freedoms. And Rorty, you know, thinks this is important. The ideal liberal society should be at least aware of that and try to ameliorate that. But he thinks that Foucault is much too one-sided, right? That Foucault, at least in some of his moods, sort of denies any validity to the liberal institutions and emphasizes only this constraintless freedom of the self. You know, Rorty says what we should do is we should privatize, this is page 65, privatize the Nietzschean, Sartrean, Foucauldian attempt at authenticity and purity in order to prevent yourself from slipping into a political attitude which will lead you to think that there is some social goal more important than avoiding cruelty. And then he brings in Habermas as somebody who is afraid of people like Foucault, in a sense, maybe not like Foucault specifically, but people who have an idea of their self-image and want to impose that on society. And so Habermas says, no. The only thing we ought to emphasize is rational discussion without force, persuasion. That is sort of the ground and ideal of our society, and we shouldn't allow in anything else, because that might, compromise our society. And again, Rorty thinks that, this is not necessary. There's nothing here to be afraid of, because this public-private distinction is going to keep people in bounds, I guess. Allow them to be authentic and good liberals at the same time. Okay, we'll see more about that later. This is what I wanted to say about chapter 3, and thereby what I wanted to say about part 1, contingency. And so in our next video, we will move on to part 2, ironism and theory.